Langston Reed, a successful black CEO and philanthropist, faces blatant racial prejudice from Officer Daniels, a corrupt cop, in a small town where systemic racism runs deep. Despite his achievements and status, Langston is wrongly targeted by Daniels simply because of his race. As Langston is subjected to microaggressions and escalating harassment, the tension rises, revealing the officer's deeply ingrained biases. The injustice Langston faces, despite his professional background, shines a stark light on the pervasive racism that continues to plague society, pushing him to stand up for himself and others in a fight for justice. Langston Reed adjusted the cuffs of his shirt as he walked through the dimly lit hallway of the local diner, the soft hum of conversations and the clink of silverware on china filling the air. The space was modest, the kind of place that offered hearty breakfasts and home-cooked meals. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the sweet scent of maple syrup and sizzling bacon, a comforting combination that felt at odds with the tension creeping into Langston's chest. He paused by the window, looking out at the small town of Millbrooke, where his family had lived for generations. It was an odd place for a man like him, successful, well-known, and respected in his field. As the heart surgeon at one of the most prestigious hospitals in the region, Langston had built his reputation on years of dedication, compassion, and precision. He had saved lives, helped families heal, and become a symbol of achievement for many in his community, particularly the black community. Yet here he was, sitting in a diner that seemed to forget who he was each time he stepped through the door. The waitress, a woman in her mid-50s with graying hair tied neatly in a bun, smiled warmly as he approached. Her name was Mary, and Langston had seen her nearly every morning since he moved back to Millbrooke after finishing his medical training. The small town, with its charming streets and family-run businesses, was where he'd grown up, but it didn't always feel like home, not anymore. "What can I get for you this morning, Dr. Reed?" Mary asked, her eyes friendly, though there was a slight hesitation when she spoke his title. It wasn't the first time that her tone felt just a little too reserved, as if unsure of how to treat the man who had somehow transcended the small-town boundaries. Langston smiled softly, shaking his head as he sat down at the counter. "Just the usual. Mary, a cup of coffee, black, and a couple of eggs over easy, and don't forget the toast." Mary nodded and quickly turned to place his order, but Langston couldn't shake the feeling that she, like everyone else in this town, still saw him as something of an outsider. They knew his name, of course, but they didn't really see him, not the way they might have seen the other doctors or professionals who had been born and raised here, people who were rooted in this town's history and culture. Langston had moved back to Millbrooke 5 years ago after his father's passing, inheriting the family home and a practice that had been established by his grandfather. It was an odd kind of honor, one that came with pressure to live up to the legacy of a family that had fought through generations of adversity. The Reed name in Millbrooke carried weight, but it was also a double-edged sword. People respected the family's roots, but they resented the way Langston had managed to escape the limitations of the town. He had left Millbrooke, gone to prestigious medical schools, earned his degrees, and become a renowned heart surgeon. But in doing so, he had left behind the small-town expectations that came with being a Reed. As he sipped his coffee, he overheard a conversation from the booth behind him. A man in his 60s was speaking to his wife in hushed tones, but Langston could still hear the words clear as day. "I heard that Langston Reed's back in town," the man said, his voice a mix of disbelief and quiet condemnation. "Ain't it something comes back to this little place after all those years? He thinks he's better than us now, like we're just some pit stop on his way to bigger things." Langston's grip on his coffee cup tightened, but he kept his face impassive, his eyes trained on the worn, wood-paneled counter in front of him. He could almost hear his father's voice in his head, urging him not to let the small minds of others affect him. But it was harder now, especially in a place like Millbrooke, where people were too eager to judge him for the success he had built, rather than the man he had become. It wasn't just the townspeople who looked at him sideways. In recent months, Langston had felt the stirrings of something deeper, a subtle, insidious kind of discomfort that came from those in power. He had been invited to serve on the board of the hospital where he worked, a great honor for any physician. But it was clear that his presence was seen as an anomaly by some of the older white members. They would exchange glances when he spoke in meetings, questioning his opinions despite his credentials. He was a black man, in a space where very few like him had ever been given a seat at the table. And the discomfort of that fact had grown more and more apparent with each passing month. Langston hadn't let it get to him at first. After all, he was used to the weight of discrimination. He had been raised in the shadow of segregation, raised by parents who taught him to work twice as hard, to prove his worth in a world that wasn't built for people like him. But as the years went on, the pressure built. He had worked so hard to carve out his place in the world, only to find that no matter how high he rose, there was always a ceiling, an invisible barrier that tried to pull him back. The familiar jingle of the diner's door opening caught Langston's attention, and he turned slightly in his seat to see a man step inside. The newcomer wore a crisp suit, his hair perfectly combed, his demeanor that of someone who had just come from a boardroom meeting, not a small-town diner. He glanced around the room, eyes scanning the patrons, before his gaze landed on Langston. Langston didn't need to be told twice. The man's eyes had already betrayed his recognition. His lips curled into a polite smile, though there was something in the way he held himself that said he knew exactly who Langston was and wasn't sure how to engage. The man made his way to the counter, taking the seat next to Langston. "Dr. Reed," the man said, his voice smooth but with an edge of forced politeness. "I didn't realize you were in town. It's been a while." Langston nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yes, I've been around, been busy with work mostly." The man's eyes flickered momentarily to Langston's attire, a simple black shirt and jeans, nothing flashy or extravagant. It wasn't the first time someone had been thrown off by his casual, modest lifestyle, especially considering his financial success. People expected him to flaunt his wealth, to live in a mansion, or drive an expensive car. But Langston had always preferred a quieter life. He had enough to live comfortably, but he wasn't interested in luxury for the sake of it. He valued the simple things: the warmth of a home-cooked meal, the laughter of family, the peace of his quiet evenings spent reading or watching the sunset from his porch. The man, clearly unsure of how to navigate this conversation, cleared his throat and looked around. "I'm just surprised you're back here so often. I mean, given your stature, I would have thought you'd prefer to spend more time in the city, New York, LA, Chicago." Langston took a slow sip of his coffee, choosing his words carefully. "I've got a life here, just like anyone else. I'm not in a rush to leave it all behind. Besides, where you come from shapes you. I've learned that it's important to remember where you came from, no matter how far you go." There was a long pause as the man absorbed Langston's words, clearly uncomfortable, but trying to mask it with a polite smile. But Langston could sense it, the subtle judgment, the quiet surprise at his unpretentious demeanor. To this man, Langston's success was expected to manifest in a different way: flamboyant, flashy, loud. Just then, the waitress brought over his food, placing the plate in front of him with a smile. Langston nodded his thanks, his gaze lingering on the meal for a moment, before he looked back at the man sitting next to him. "I've always believed in working hard," Langston said softly, almost to himself. "But more importantly, I believe in showing up for the people who've supported you, the ones who've kept you grounded." The man's expression softened slightly, but it wasn't enough to mask the underlying tension. "You know, Langston, a lot of people in this town have a lot of questions. Questions about how a man like you can come from where you come from and make it so far. It's not that we don't appreciate your success. It's just that sometimes it's hard for some folks to understand." Langston's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, a chill running through him. He had heard it all before. The assumptions, the quiet doubts about his worthiness, about how his success seemed like an anomaly. He didn't take offense easily, but the way this man phrased it, as though it were something to be understood and explained, rubbed him the wrong way. "Maybe it's not about understanding," Langston replied, his voice calm but firm. "Maybe it's about accepting that people like me deserve to be where we are, just like anyone else." The man opened his mouth as if to respond, but Langston cut him off, his tone leaving no room for further discussion. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to finish my breakfast in peace." The man hesitated for a moment before nodding awkwardly and standing up, walking toward the door. Langston returned his focus to his meal, trying to shake the unease that settled over him. As the door swung shut behind the man, Langston knew this wouldn't be the last time he faced this kind of treatment in Millbrooke. His success, his standing. It would always be under scrutiny in some way, but he had worked too hard to let that hold him back. His identity as a black man, a doctor, a son of Millbrooke, wasn't something to be diminished or reduced. It was something he would defend, no matter the cost. But as he finished his breakfast and prepared to leave, he had a sense that something much bigger than uncomfortable interactions at a diner was brewing. This town, his place in it, the power structures that controlled it. Langston knew that the time for quiet resilience was coming to an end. The world would need to hear what he had to say. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be without resistance, but Langston Reed was done being overlooked. And whatever came next, he would face it head on. Langston Reed's day didn't improve as the hours ticked by. The familiar weight of subtle prejudice seemed to follow him wherever he went. After finishing his breakfast at the diner, he drove to his office at Millbrooke Memorial Hospital. He'd learned to tune out the occasional glance, the quiet whispers of surprise when people realized who he was. A black man with his credentials and his lifestyle wasn't a common sight in a town like Millbrooke, and the discomfort was usually palpable. Walking into the hospital, Langston passed through the polished glass doors and made his way down the sterile, white-walled corridor. The nurses offered polite smiles, some of them still struggling to hide their surprise that he was working in their town at all. But their expressions softened when he returned their greetings with warmth and professionalism. He had long learned how to keep his distance emotionally while still carrying himself with the dignity that his role demanded. But today, something felt different. He could sense it in the air. People looked at him just a little too long. Whispers seemed louder than usual. It wasn't just curiosity about his success. It was suspicion. There was a tension in the room, as though they couldn't quite figure out how to reconcile the man they saw before them with their preconceived notions of who he should be. The first sign came from Dr. Robert Keegan, the senior cardiologist, an older white man who'd once been a mentor of sorts to Langston. At least, that's how Langston had seen it when he first started at Millbrooke Memorial. Now, Langston couldn't shake the feeling that Keegan had begun to look at him with an unspoken wariness, an unease that went beyond their professional disagreements. Langston had noticed it during their last meeting when Keegan dismissed his suggestions about a new treatment protocol without so much as a second glance. Today, as they stood in the hallway, Keegan's tone was sharp, almost condescending. "Langston," he began, nodding at him, but not quite meeting his eyes. "I saw the report on the patient in room 204. I think you'll find that the traditional method is still the best approach. The procedure you suggested last week is unconventional. It's not exactly in line with hospital policy." Langston could feel the tightness in his chest. He knew what Keegan was implying without needing to say it aloud. The procedure in question had been a cutting-edge, experimental approach that Langston had seen work wonders in New York. But here, in the small-town hospital, it was met with skepticism and, he suspected, a healthy dose of mistrust. "I understand your concerns, Dr. Keegan, but the data from the trial speaks for itself. It's been used successfully in several larger hospitals," Langston replied, keeping his voice even. He'd learned to stay calm in these moments, to diffuse the tension with professionalism. The patient in question would benefit from the procedure. Keegan didn't even bother to argue the merits of the procedure anymore. His dismissiveness was obvious. "Perhaps, but I think we'll stick with what we know here," Keegan said, the words sharp, almost cutting. "Millbrooke isn't a big city, Langston. We don't need to be on the bleeding edge, we just need to do things the right way." Langston didn't respond immediately. He could feel his patience fraying, his temper rising. His fingers tightened around the folder he was holding, but he knew better than to let his emotions get the better of him. He had spent years learning how to navigate these moments, how to speak the language of power without betraying his own sense of identity. "Understood, Dr. Keegan," he said quietly, his eyes locking with Keegan's. "But when the time comes to push the boundaries, I'll be here, trying to make sure we don't fall behind." Keegan's eyes flicked away, and Langston turned on his heel to leave, his heart pounding as he walked down the corridor. It wasn't the first time his expertise had been questioned by those who were older, who had been in the field longer. But something about Keegan's attitude today felt more deliberate, like a message. The tension only deepened when Langston arrived at the courthouse that afternoon. He had been summoned to speak in front of a local judge about a medical malpractice case that involved a patient who had died under questionable circumstances. It wasn't an unusual assignment. Langston frequently testified as an expert in medical cases, but today's experience felt different. As he entered the courthouse, Langston was met with the usual courteous nods from the clerks, though he noticed a couple of them exchanged glances when he walked past. Millbrooke wasn't a large town, and everyone knew everyone. It wasn't uncommon for Langston to be recognized as he made his way through the halls, but this time, the stairs felt heavier. He couldn't tell if it was the case he was testifying in, or if his very presence was still viewed with a mixture of respect and disbelief. He entered the courtroom, where he was greeted by the defense attorney, a middle-aged white man with a no-nonsense demeanor, and Judge Ronald Hayes, an older judge whose reputation for being tough was well known in the town. Langston had crossed paths with Hayes before in a professional capacity, but today felt like something new. "Dr. Reed," Judge Hayes greeted him, his tone stiff. "Thank you for coming today. We're all aware of your extensive experience in the field, but we appreciate you making time to assist with this matter." Langston nodded politely, taking his seat. He wasn't sure if it was the judge's deliberate formality or the way the defense attorney was already eyeing him, but the air in the room felt charged. As Langston sat down, he couldn't help but notice the subtle ways in which they treated him differently than they would have treated another expert witness. A white expert, someone who had the same qualifications but didn't carry the weight of suspicion that Langston had to bear. As the proceedings began, the defense attorney wasted no time in questioning Langston's qualifications and methods, even though the medical reports were clear and his testimony had been requested by the family of the deceased. He asked questions that were meant to imply doubt, subtly undermining Langston's expertise as if it were a game of chess, a quiet contest of power that Langston couldn't afford to lose. "I'm sure you understand, Dr. Reed," the attorney said, his voice laced with condescension, "that it's not unusual for doctors to make mistakes. After all, you can't always predict how a patient will respond, can you? Especially with a procedure as complex as the one in this case." Langston maintained his composure, but a flicker of frustration stirred within him. He had seen this before. The insinuation that a black doctor's success had more to do with luck or privilege than competence. It was a silent accusation that he didn't belong, that he didn't deserve the position he held, but he had been in enough courtrooms to know better than to rise to the bait. His every word, his every action, had to be calculated. "No, we can't predict everything," Langston replied carefully, his voice steady. "But the data supports the procedure we followed. I stand by my findings, and I believe the course of action was sound given the circumstances." The attorney raised an eyebrow, clearly displeased that Langston wasn't flustered. "You're sure about that, Dr. Reed? I'd be curious to know if your conclusions would stand up to the scrutiny of a second opinion, given that your methods are unconventional for this town." There it was. The subtle dig. The implication that Langston, because of his background, was somehow unfit to make decisions in a small town setting. His mind raced, but he kept his face neutral. "I've offered my opinion based on years of experience," Langston replied, "and I'm confident in its validity. If you'd like another opinion, you're more than welcome to seek it, but I stand by the care I provided." The defense attorney pressed again, this time more aggressively. "You might stand by your decision, Dr. Reed, but I wonder if you truly understand the context here. This is Millbrooke. We're not New York City. We don't have your resources. Your expertise might be appreciated in a larger city, but here, we have to make do with what we've got." Langston could feel the simmering anger rise in his chest, but he held it in check. He had dealt with this for years, being underestimated, overlooked, or questioned simply because of where he came from, or the color of his skin. He stood up slowly, his voice now firm, as he addressed the courtroom. "Let me make something clear. The standards of care don't change based on the town or the resources available. What matters is the ability to make the best decision for the patient, based on the information at hand, and that's exactly what I did." Judge Hayes's gavel came down with a sharp crack, signaling the end of the exchange. "Thank you, Dr. Reed," Hayes said curtly, as though cutting the conversation short. Langston returned to his seat, but the feeling of being out of place, the feeling of being judged not for his knowledge, but for his very existence, lingered in the air. He knew the battle wasn't just about proving his qualifications, It was about surviving the quiet, insidious bias that existed in every corner of his life. And as the session came to a close, he couldn't help but feel that this case, much like everything else in his career, had taken on a deeper, more personal meaning. The conflict, he realized, wasn't just in the courtroom, it was everywhere, and it was only a matter of time before it reached a boiling point. Langston Reed could feel the walls closing in. The tension had been building for weeks, ever since the incident in the courtroom, the subtle glances, the whispered comments, and the veiled hostility he had encountered in every corner of Millbrooke. But today, it had all come to a head. It started with a phone call, a routine one, or so it seemed at first. Dr. Langston Reed had received an invitation to speak at a community fundraiser for the hospital, a seemingly innocuous event that would have been just another opportunity to support a cause close to his heart. But as he walked into the small community hall, the sight of a few familiar faces greeted him, their smiles hiding thinly veiled hostility. The room had been crowded with local professionals, many of them eager to appear supportive in public, but Langston could see the truth in their eyes. They resented his success, his authority, and the quiet power he wielded, all earned through years of sacrifice and grit. To them, Langston represented something they feared: the idea that someone from a small town could rise to prominence, that he could become someone more than what they believed he was meant to be. Langston was used to this. He had navigated these subtle social boundaries his entire life, but what he wasn't prepared for was the sudden, explosive eruption of injustice that would play out right before his eyes. Langston had been halfway through his speech when it happened. A young officer, Officer Daniels, entered the hall. Daniels had been a rising star in Millbrooke's police force, tall, aggressive, and all too eager to make his mark. Langston had crossed paths with him a few times before, but today was different. The officer's eyes locked onto Langston's with a cold, calculating gaze. His expression was unreadable, but Langston could see the tension in his posture, the subtle way he moved through the crowd, as if searching for something. The moment didn't hit Langston immediately. It was subtle, creeping beneath the surface like an unspoken truth that only those who had lived through it would understand. But then, when Officer Daniels stepped up to the stage, his intentions became clear. "Dr. Reed," Officer Daniels called out, his voice cutting through the applause, his tone sharp. "I'm afraid I need to speak with you. It's an urgent matter, something that requires your immediate attention." Langston froze, a flicker of confusion passing through him. The event was supposed to be a professional affair, not a place for interruption. His mind raced. Why would Officer Daniels need to speak to him now, and in such a public manner? "I'm afraid this isn't the place for this conversation, Officer Daniels," Langston said, his voice calm but firm. He had seen these types of power moves before. Men like Daniels who felt the need to assert their authority, to remind others of their place. "I'm in the middle of addressing a gathering right now. Whatever this is can certainly wait until later." Daniels took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "No, Dr. Reed," he said, his voice hardening. "It can't wait. I need you to come with me now." A hush fell over the crowd, but Langston could feel the undercurrent of anticipation in the room. The whispers began, as if the entire town was watching, waiting for something to unfold. Langston stood there for a moment, trying to process the situation. His mind raced. He was a doctor, a highly respected figure in the community. Why would an officer treat him like this? What had he done to warrant such treatment? But the officer's stance was unwavering. Daniels wasn't asking, he was demanding. And Langston knew that if he didn't comply, things could escalate. "Officer," Langston began, his voice steady, but laced with frustration. "I don't know what this is about, but I'm not going anywhere with you. If there's a problem, we can handle it professionally, but I'm not stepping down from this stage. I have a responsibility to these people." Daniels didn't move. Instead, he looked at Langston, as though he were the one who had crossed a line, as though his refusal to cooperate was an affront to his authority. "I'm giving you one chance, Dr. Reed," Daniels said through gritted teeth, the threat implicit in his words. "Step down from that stage, or I'll have to take you in." Langston's heart began to pound, but he kept his face calm. He could feel the heat rise in his chest, the blood rushing to his ears, but he couldn't afford to let it show. He was used to moments like this, the constant battle between the anger that threatened to break free and the calm resolve he had honed over years of fighting against bias. He was about to respond when something in Daniel's posture changed. He shifted his weight, reaching for his radio with a practiced motion, his eyes never leaving Langston. The tension was palpable, the room waiting for the inevitable next step. A small part of Langston's mind wondered if this was some kind of mistake. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had no idea why he was being treated this way, but he knew deep down that it didn't matter. To Daniels, he wasn't a respected surgeon. He wasn't the man who had saved lives. He was just another black man to be controlled. "Don't make me do this," Daniels repeated, now standing right in front of Langston. "You're making this worse for yourself." Before Langston could react, Daniels turned and called for backup, his voice raised now, as if signaling an escalation. Langston's body stiffened. He knew exactly what was happening. He was being framed, unjustly accused, and forcefully made to comply with something that was built on a lie. It wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. The room had gone silent, the weight of the situation settling over everyone. Langston knew they were all watching. Some were frozen in shock, others in disbelief, and a few, he noticed, had turned their gaze away, perhaps too uncomfortable to face the situation. Head on, Langston's fingers clenched at his sides as he fought to maintain composure. "Officer, I don't know what you're talking about," Langston said, his voice cold and measured, despite the storm raging within him. "I'm not going anywhere with you. If you think I've done something wrong, then arrest me. But know this, I'll be filing a report, and I will have legal counsel present." Daniels, however, was unmoved. His stance didn't falter, his grip on the radio tightening. He didn't believe Langston. He believed his assumptions, the ones that had been ingrained in him since birth, the ones that told him a black man like Langston couldn't possibly have earned his place. This wasn't about law, it was about power, about dominance. And in this moment, Daniels was making it clear that he didn't see Langston as a peer, as a man of his stature. He saw Langston as a threat, a man to be taken down. A few moments later, more officers stormed in, their heavy boots sounding like a drumbeat of impending doom. The officers were more aggressive, their eyes scanning Langston with a coldness that sent a shiver through him. One officer, a younger man, took a step forward, his gaze full of uncertainty, but Daniels shot him a look that silenced him immediately. "Take him," Daniels ordered, his voice low but forceful. At that moment, Langston's mind raced. He had been through many tense situations in his life, but this was something else entirely. He was being unjustly targeted, profiled in broad daylight. It was a nightmare, and the worst part was that it wasn't even surprising. It was exactly what he had feared would happen when he returned to Millbrooke, despite all his efforts to make a difference. His anger boiled over, but he kept it contained. The thought of his father, of the countless men and women who had fought just to be seen as human, kept him grounded. But the overwhelming sense of helplessness threatened to swallow him. This wasn't a conversation he could win with words. This wasn't something that could be solved by reason or diplomacy. He had to make a stand. "Take me in then," Langston said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet fire. "But know this, I'm not backing down, not from you, and not from the system that put you in this position." One of the officers hesitated. Langston could see the internal conflict in his eyes. But Daniels was already making his way toward him. With a swift motion, Daniels reached for Langston's arm, but Langston stepped back, refusing to be handled like a common criminal. "Don't touch me," Langston said through gritted teeth, his voice a razor-sharp warning. Daniels' hand faltered for a moment, but the officers behind him pushed forward, their eyes fixed on Langston like they were waiting for a signal from their superior. Langston took a deep breath, steeling himself. If he had to fight this, if he had to stand his ground and confront the system head-on, he would do it with dignity. But as the officers moved closer, his heart hammered in his chest. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every black man and woman who had ever faced this kind of injustice. And in that moment, Langston Reed knew that his fight had only just begun. Langston Reed stood at the edge of the stage, his pulse quickening as the tension in the room thickened. Officer Daniels's demand for him to step down felt like an affront, a challenge he wasn't about to back down from. His hands were clenched into fists, though he had learned long ago to keep his anger in check. His thoughts, sharp and focused, were running through the steps of what could happen next. He was surrounded by people who didn't understand him, who saw his success as an anomaly, as something they could never quite accept. And here was one of them, trying to strip him of his dignity in front of an audience. He had known something like this might happen. It had been in the air for weeks, like the calm before a storm. But still, the magnitude of it hit him like a blow. His identity as a successful black surgeon in a small town had always been under scrutiny. His every movement watched, his every word second-guessed. Today, however, it wasn't the usual quiet judgment. It was a direct confrontation, a challenge to his very existence. Daniels was standing just inches from him now, close enough for Langston to smell the faint musk of his cologne, a sharp contrast to the clinical sterility of the community hall. He had no intention of letting Langston walk out of here with any sense of pride, any sense of victory. "Dr. Reed, you can either step down now, or I'll have no choice but to place you under arrest," Daniels said again, his voice unwavering, thick with authority. The crowd was silent now, each person holding their breath. The weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. Langston's eyes flicked to the faces around him. He saw fear, disbelief, confusion. Some of the onlookers looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. A few turned their eyes away, as if they didn't want to witness what was coming. Langston swallowed the rising frustration. He knew how this would go. The officers would escalate things, twist the situation, and no one would believe him. They never did. No one ever believed that someone like him, successful, educated, even beloved in some circles, could be a victim of racial injustice. He was expected to conform to the roles they assigned to him. Be grateful, be humble, and never make waves. And when he did, like now, when he stood his ground, it was seen as a threat. But Langston wasn't just going to let this go. His career had been a constant battle to rise above the assumptions about his race, to prove that he belonged. But today, everything was on the line. He wasn't going to let this officer, this symbol of the corrupt system that had been at odds with him his entire life, get away with it. "You're making a mistake," Langston said, his voice calm but laced with an edge. "There's nothing for you to arrest me for. This is nothing more than an abuse of power. If you want to arrest me, you're going to have to come up with a reason." His heart pounded, but his voice remained steady. Every word was calculated. He needed to be in control. If he lost his composure now, everything would fall apart. Daniels didn't back down. Instead, his grip tightened on the radio at his waist, and Langston's eyes followed the movement. He knew that this could turn into something far uglier than a verbal confrontation. The officer had already called for backup. The moment the other officers arrived, Langston's chances of walking out of here with his dignity intact would be slim. At the far side of the room, Langston caught sight of Mitchell, one of the only allies he had in Millbrooke. Mitchell had always been supportive. He had known Langston for years, and their relationship was built on mutual respect. Mitchell was standing near the back of the room, his face tense, his hand hovering nervously over his phone. Langston's gaze locked onto his. It was as if he could feel the weight of Mitchell's silent question. Should he intervene? Langston didn't have time to answer. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway, and before Langston could react, more officers poured into the room. The backup had arrived, their uniforms stiff and their eyes hard. Langston counted at least 3 more men, all in varying stages of alertness. Some looking at him like he was a problem to be dealt with, others more cautiously observing the situation. Daniels turned to them, giving a slight nod. "I need him out of here," he said, his voice low but firm. The officers started moving toward Langston, their hands twitching near their belts. Langston could see the way they moved. Too calculated, too ready. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. They were preparing for a confrontation, and Langston knew the moment he resisted, they would have an excuse to escalate further. The rage in Langston's chest grew. The injustice of it all, the humiliation, the bias, the unfair treatment he had faced countless times, flashed before him. He had been silent for too long, letting these small injustices pile up until they became too heavy to ignore. But he wasn't about to let it all come crashing down today. Not here, not now, "Don't touch me," Langston said, his voice low but filled with a quiet, unwavering authority. "I am not your target. I am not your enemy. You are making a mistake, and you'll regret it." Daniels stepped forward, his face inches from Langston's, and the other officers closed in behind him. Langston didn't flinch. He stood tall, his posture firm, refusing to let fear seep into his stance. One of the officers, younger and clearly unsure of himself, stepped closer, his eyes flicking nervously between Langston and Daniels. There was a slight hesitation in his movements, but Daniels didn't seem to notice. His eyes were locked on Langston, the hostility clear in his gaze. "You've made this harder on yourself than it needs to be," Daniels spat, his voice a venomous growl. "Step away from the stage now." The room felt smaller with every passing second. Langston could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, their expectations like a weight on his shoulders. He knew that if this continued, if they took him out of here in handcuffs, it would be a public spectacle. And in a small town like Millbrooke, the humiliation wouldn't stop at this room. It would echo through every street, every business, and every conversation for weeks. He could feel the eyes of Mitchell, watching from the corner, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Langston could sense his hesitation, could hear his unspoken plea. "Langston, please, don't do anything rash." But Langston couldn't. Not anymore. His resolve was solid. He would not be silenced. Not by Daniels. Not by this town. Not by the system that had always worked against him. "I've had enough," Langston said, his voice hard, final. "I'm leaving now, and you can either let me go or you can arrest me, but I won't be intimidated by you, not now, not ever." There was a moment of hesitation, and for the first time, Langston saw a flicker of doubt in Daniels' eyes. For a split second, it felt like time slowed, like Langston could reach out and make this stop. But before he could make the decision to walk away, the younger officer stepped forward, his hand reaching for Langston's arm. Langston moved before he could think, his body reacting with the precision of someone who had faced danger his entire life. He swerved out of the officer's reach, his hand rising to gently push him back. The officer stumbled slightly, eyes wide with surprise, but it wasn't the officer that Langston was concerned about. It was Daniels. Daniels' hand shot to his gun, a blur of motion that sent a cold shiver through Langston's spine. In that instant, everything seemed to stop. The room went quiet, and the hum of the lights above suddenly felt like a pressure on his chest. Langston could see it in Daniels' eyes, fear, control, and the need to assert dominance. "Step back," Daniels shouted, his voice cracking. The command was more for the officers around him than for Langston. Langston held his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. The adrenaline coursed through his veins, his body primed for a confrontation, but his mind stayed sharp. He needed to stay in control, needed to ensure that his next move would be calculated. His hand was already moving toward his phone, reaching into his pocket for his camera. He had documented too many moments like this to let it slip by without recording the truth. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, Langston's phone buzzed in his pocket. Mitchell's message. The text read, "Get out of here, it's not worth it, I'll help you later." Langston glanced down at the phone, his breath shaky, but his decision was made. Before Daniels could react, Langston turned, his steps swift and purposeful. He didn't look back. This wasn't just about survival, it was about making sure that the system saw him, not as an aggressor, but as a man who refused to be silenced. He was done playing by their rules, and now, he would make sure they saw the fight he was about to bring. The air in the community hall felt thick, oppressive, as Langston Reed stood, facing Officer Daniels, his back straight and his resolve unwavering. The other officers had formed a tight perimeter around him, their faces a mix of uncertainty and hostility, and the murmurs of the crowd, once silent, were growing louder with every passing second. Langston's heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his body still. He knew that one wrong move, one show of weakness, would be enough to give Daniels the upper hand. Langston had been down this road before, facing men like Daniels, men who thought their badges gave them the power to strip others of their dignity, their humanity. But Langston had something Daniels didn't: the truth. "You're making a mistake, Daniels," Langston said, his voice low but firm. "This is about more than just me. It's about the system you represent, the system that's been crushing people like me for years. and it's about time someone called you out on it." Daniel's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. "Oh, I'm the one making a mistake." He stepped closer, his chest puffing out in false bravado. "You're the one who's been playing the system, Reed, acting like you're above it all. Well, I'm here to put you in your place." Langston didn't flinch. He had heard it all before. Those words, those empty threats, the narrative they told themselves about people like him. But this time, he wouldn't let it slide. "I've been playing the system, Daniels." "No," Langston said, his voice rising with controlled anger. "I've been working within it. I've been working my ass off, trying to make a difference in a town that can't see past its own prejudice. I've put in the work, and I've earned my place. And now, here you are, trying to strip me of it. Trying to make me a criminal in front of my own people. And for what? Because I'm black? Because I made something of myself?" Daniel's expression twisted, his eyes flashing with something dangerous, something beyond simple disdain. He was furious now, but Langston wasn't finished. "You're not fooling anyone. Not me, and certainly not this room full of people," Langston continued, his words sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. "You've got an agenda, Daniels, and I'm not the only one who's been on the receiving end of your abuse. People like me, people who don't fit your narrow view of the world, they're tired. We're tired of being treated like criminals just because of the color of our skin." For a moment, the room went dead silent. Langston could feel every pair of eyes on him, the weight of their gazes pressing down on him. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for every person who had ever been targeted, silenced, or made to feel small by the corrupt system that allowed men like Daniels to hold power. But Daniels wasn't backing down. His fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with anger. "You think you're some kind of hero? Some righteous man standing up for the people? You're nothing but a victim, Reed. You're a black man who thinks he can just waltz into my town and act like he belongs, but that's not how it works. You're just another guy looking to make trouble, and I'm done with it." Langston's pulse quickened, but his mind remained clear. He couldn't let Daniels provoke him into a physical confrontation. He had to outsmart him, outthink him. Langston had the tools, his knowledge, his education, his experience. But more importantly, he had the truth. And that was something Daniels could never take away. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Daniels," Langston said, his voice quieter now, more composed. "I'm here to expose it. To expose men like you, who hide behind badges and think they can control the world. You're not just mistreating me, you're mistreating everyone who looks like me. You're part of a system that has been designed to keep us down, but you're not going to get away with it. Not this time." Daniels took another step forward, his face inches from Langston's. The rage in his eyes was palpable, a raw, visceral hatred that Langston could feel in the pit of his stomach. For a brief moment, it seemed like Daniels might strike him. Langston braced himself, his fists clenched, his entire body coiled like a spring. But then, the sound of a car door slamming broke the tension. Langston turned his head, his eyes catching sight of a black SUV pulling into the parking lot. Mitchell, he was here. The familiar face, the one man who had always supported Langston through the toughest of times, had arrived. He hadn't called for help. He hadn't made a scene. But Mitchell's presence was enough to shift the balance, to remind Daniels and the officers around him that Langston wasn't alone. "Mitchell," Langston called, his voice steady. "Get your camera out. This is it." Mitchell hesitated for just a moment, but then he nodded. He knew what Langston meant. He pulled out his phone, his fingers moving quickly as he began recording the scene. Langston felt a surge of determination. He wasn't just going to let Daniels get away with this. He had the evidence now, the proof that everything Daniels was doing was nothing more than a power grab, a corrupt display of authority. Daniels saw the movement, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of Mitchell. "What are you doing, Reed?" he snarled, his voice venomous. "Think this is going to save you?" Langston stood tall, his expression resolute. "It's going to expose you," he said firmly, meeting Daniels' gaze with an unwavering strength. "It's going to show everyone who you really are." The other officers shifted uncomfortably, the tension in the room rising like an electric current. Langston could see their hesitation now. He wasn't the only one who was fed up with the corruption, with the abuse of power. Even if they couldn't say it, even if they couldn't act, they could see it. Langston wasn't the problem, Daniels was. But Daniels wasn't finished. He stepped back, his hands twitching, his fingers grazing the holster on his belt. The threat was clear. "You think you can just record your way out of this? You think this little stunt is going to get you anywhere?" His eyes were wild now, desperate. "You've made a huge mistake, Reed." Langston's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was sharp. This was it. This was the breaking point. He couldn't back down now. He had the power. He had the truth. And now he just had to make sure he didn't let Daniels turn this into something bigger than it already was. "I didn't make the mistake, Daniels," Langston said, his voice steady but full of fire. "You did. You're the one who decided to take things too far. You're the one who's been abusing your power. And it's all going to come out, every last bit of it." For a moment, Daniels stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief, his body stiff with frustration. He hadn't expected Langston to fight back this way, but Langston wasn't backing down. Not anymore. He had put in the years, the work, and the sacrifice to be where he was, and no one, not Daniels or anyone else, was going to strip that away from him. But just as Langston opened his mouth to say more, a voice rang out from the back of the room. It was Mitchell, his voice strong and filled with the same sense of urgency that had been building in Langston. "Everyone needs to get out of here. This is bigger than just this moment. We've got the footage, we've got the evidence. We're not backing down. This ends today." Langston felt a sense of relief wash over him. Mitchell's support was unwavering, and his words had done something the officers hadn't expected. It had shifted the tide, and the room had finally recognized what was happening. Langston wasn't just a victim. He was a force to be reckoned with. Daniels turned to the other officers, his face a mix of frustration and fear. He could feel the walls closing in. He had pushed too far, and now he wasn't sure how to get out of it. But before the officers could react, the sound of sirens cut through the air. The backup was here. Langston felt the weight of the moment. The sirens weren't just the sound of law enforcement arriving, they were the sound of justice, of accountability. The sirens were signaling that the time for silence was over, that the time for change had come. As the officers began to disperse, Langston stood his ground, his mind racing with what had just transpired. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The system that had allowed men like Daniels to thrive was still in place. But today, Langston had taken a stand, and that was just the beginning. Langston Reed's chest tightened as Officer Daniels's hand hovered dangerously close to his gun, the weight of the moment thick in the air. He could feel the heat of the tension surrounding him, the room seemingly shrinking with every breath. For years, he had worked tirelessly to rise above the stereotypes, proving himself to be a leader in the community, a man of dignity and respect. Yet here he was, standing in front of the very system he had worked within, with Daniels trying to break him down, to reduce him to the very thing he had fought so hard not to be. A target. "You think you're better than everyone else, don't you?" Daniels snarled, stepping closer, his breath heavy with the weight of his own anger. "Just because you've got a title, because you've got money, you think that makes you special? You think that makes you above the law?" Langston didn't flinch. His body was coiled, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He had been in tight spots before, forced to navigate through the same systems that tried to silence him, to diminish his worth. But this time, he wasn't going to be intimidated. This wasn't about his career. This was about something much bigger. The right to live freely, without fear, without prejudice. "I don't think I'm better than anyone else," Langston said slowly, meeting Daniels' seething gaze. "But I'm not going to let you or anyone else treat me like I don't belong here. You don't get to make that decision." Daniels' eyes flicked to the side, a slight moment of hesitation before his grip on his radio tightened, and the other officers in the room, who had been standing passively by, began to shift their stances. Langston felt their gazes, but he ignored them, focusing only on the officer in front of him. His resolve was unshakable. "You're wrong," Daniels sneered, a hint of satisfaction creeping into his voice. "You've made a mess of everything. You think the system's broken, that it's all rigged against people like you. Well, guess what, Reed? This is how it works, and you're not above it. I'm just making sure you know your place." Langston's eyes narrowed. The hatred in Daniels' voice, the unfiltered racism, cut through him like a knife. It wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had been judged by the color of their skin instead of their character. Langston had fought his whole life to escape the limitations placed on him by his race. But it was clear now that for people like Daniels, no amount of success, no title, no credentials could ever shield him. Langston's voice remained even, calm, despite the fury burning inside him. This isn't about a place. This is about power. You have it, and you think you can use it however you want. But I'm not afraid of you. Daniel's lips twisted into a tight, bitter smile. Afraid of me? You should be. He reached for his gun, his fingers brushing the cold metal, a moment of pure malice before he stopped. His eyes flicked to the crowd, to Langston's allies in the room. He wasn't just threatening Langston anymore, he was threatening the very people who had supported him. The crowd that had grown quiet, shifting uneasily as the situation escalated. Langston's mind raced. He had to think fast, had to stay one step ahead. This could go downhill fast, and one wrong move could mean the end of this fight before it even started. He had the tools, his training, his knowledge, his presence in this community. But none of that would matter if the system came crashing down on him. Then he heard it. The sound of a door opening behind him, the soft shuffle of footsteps. A shadow fell over Langston's back. Mitchell. Langston's heart skipped a beat. Mitchell, one of the few men he trusted in Millbrooke, had been quietly filming the entire exchange. As Langston had planned, Mitchell's phone had been out, capturing everything. It wasn't just about standing up to Daniels anymore. It was about documenting the truth. Stop! Mitchell's voice rang out from the back of the room. This is all on tape. Don't make this worse for yourself, Daniels. For a moment, there was silence. The officers, all of them, paused. Langston's eyes flicked toward the back of the room, where Mitchell stood. Phone held out toward the front, he was calmly recording, his expression unwavering. Despite the rising danger, Daniels turned sharply toward Mitchell, his eyes blazing with fury. "Get that camera out of my face!" Daniels barked, his hand instinctively reaching for his radio, as if to call for backup. Langston moved quickly, his heart pounding in his chest, but his movements deliberate and calculated. "You can't stop the truth, Daniels," Langston said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "You can't intimidate everyone into silence. This is bigger than you." Daniels glared at him, the weight of the moment finally sinking in. He knew what was at stake. He knew the power of this footage, what it could do to him, to his reputation, to the department that protected him. It wasn't just about Langston anymore, it was about Daniels' own skin. Daniels opened his mouth, about to retort, but then, suddenly, he froze. His gaze shifted toward the door as sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder by the second backup was arriving. Langston's jaw clenched. This was it. The cavalry was on the way, but would they side with the corrupt officer or with Langston? Would the truth finally be enough to tip the scales in his favor? Or would they just sweep it under the rug as they always had? "You've got a decision to make," Langston said, taking a step forward, his eyes locking with Daniels. The heat of the confrontation made his skin flush, but he wouldn't back down. "You can try to cover this up, you can make excuses, or you can face the consequences, but I won't let you intimidate me anymore. I won't let you take me down without a fight." Daniels looked between Langston and the officers around him, the fear in his eyes growing, though he tried to hide it behind a mask of bravado. "I'm not afraid of you," Daniels growled. But there was a tremor in his voice now, a crack in the shield of invincibility he'd been wearing for so long. "You should be," Langston replied, his voice low and firm, steady. "You've done this before. You've gotten away with it, but it ends now." Before Daniels could respond, the door opened fully, and a group of officers, led by another commanding officer, entered the room. Their faces were grave, their movements swift. Langston could feel his heart beating even faster. This was the moment of truth. Would they listen to Daniels, the officer who had been part of the system for so long? Or would they listen to Langston, the man who had endured this type of treatment his whole life and was finally ready to stand up and fight back? The new officer, tall and imposing, scanned the room, his eyes narrowing as he took in the situation. He looked at Daniels, then at Langston, his expression unreadable. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his voice commanding. Daniels stepped forward quickly, but his confidence had faded. "This man's been causing a scene. I'm asking him to step down." Langston held his ground, his eyes never leaving Daniels. "I'm not stepping down," Not this time. The new officer raised an eyebrow, sensing the shift in power, sensing the truth in Langston's words. He glanced at Mitchell, still holding the phone, still filming the entire scene. Then, he looked back at Langston, his expression slowly softening. "We've got it on tape," the officer said, nodding toward Mitchell. "I think it's clear who's been causing the problem." For a moment, Daniels stood frozen, his mouth hanging open, the realization sinking in that he had gone too far. The evidence was undeniable. The tape, the witnesses, the way the situation had escalated. The system, which had always shielded him, was crumbling before his eyes. Langston exhaled slowly, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, but a flicker of triumph lit up his chest. The truth had been captured, and the tides were shifting. For the first time in his life, he felt the power of his voice, the weight of his actions, making a real difference. But the fight wasn't over. The officers were still there, and Langston knew that even with the evidence, there was always a fight to be had. Daniels turned to leave, his body tense with rage and defeat, but Langston's eyes followed him. The finality in the air was palpable, but even as the sirens outside grew louder, Langston knew that this was just the beginning. Langston's body remained still, but his mind was racing. This wasn't over, not yet. It never was. The truth had been exposed, but the road to justice would be long and full of battles, each one harder than the last. And as the officers moved to speak with Daniels, Langston didn't back down. Not now, not ever.